If the United States ever stopped paying its debt, the world economy would implode in less than 48 hours. Banks would freeze, markets would vanish, and every dollar in your wallet would suddenly mean nothing. Welcome to the Chronology of Wealth, where money, power, and history collide. Varsalen, Metinwit we call US debt isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It's the foundation of modern civilization, the invisible architecture that holds up everything from your mortgage to the global price of oil. If that structure ever cracked, it wouldn't just be an American problem. It would be a global collapse of faith, the end of the financial world as we know it. But before we imagine the fall, we need to understand the paradox. How did the richest nation in history become the most indebted one? It started in 1790. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton did something radical. He embraced the debt. He argued that if America could borrow and pay reliably, it would prove itself trustworthy, a safe bet in a world of broken empires. Hamilton's gamble worked. The United States began issuing bonds and honouring them. Confidence grew. The new republic didn't just win its freedom through war. It financed its future through faith. That faith became the foundation of US global power. Every major era of growth was financed through borrowing. Debt wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the engine of expansion. By 1944, at Bretton Woods, 44 nations anchored the global financial system to the US dollar and the dollar to gold. This meant every major currency now depended on America's promise. The United States held 2/3 of the world's gold. Confidence in the dollar was absolute. The American debt became the world's savings account. But nothing built on faith stays stable forever. By the late 1960s, dollars were leaving the country to fast. Nations started demanding the metal instead of the paper. Then, in 1971, President Richard Nixon made the most consequential financial decision of the century: severe the Dollarsekunde link to gold. Overnight, money was no longer tied to anything physical. Its value depended entirely on confidence and on the US government's promise to keep paying its debts. That promise created what we live under today, the debt standard. Gold no longer backed the dollar. The world's trust in US treasuries did. It was a quiet revolution. For the first time, the United States could create infinite credit as long as the world kept believing in it. Treasury bonds became the safest asset on earth, not because they were risk-free, but because everyone agreed to treat them that way. When you hear about the national debt, you're not hearing about a bill to be paid. You're hearing about the core infrastructure of global finance. Every loan, every derivative, every credit card interest rate sits somewhere on top of US government debt. And the system depends on one simple ritual. When old bonds mature, the US issues new ones. It never truly repays its debt. It just rolls it over forever. But if that chain ever breaks, if the government misses even one payment, the illusion shatters instantly. Treasury bonds are the collateral that underpins the entire global banking system. A default would mean that the risk-free asset isn't risk-free anymore. Liquidity would vanish within hours. Banks would stop trusting each other. The dollar would plummet. We've seen the tremors before. In 2011, Congress's near failure to raise the debt ceiling caused the US credit rating to be downgraded for the first time in history. Markets lost trillions in weeks all over a political standoff. These weren't financial crises, they were psychological ones. Because the entire world economy is built on a single assumption: that the United States will always pay. That assumption has turned debt into America's most powerful export. Other nations trade goods, America trades promises. And that's the great paradox of American power. The United States doesn't need to eliminate its debt, it needs to maintain it. The rest of the world demands it. Debt is no longer a liability. It's the product. But even the strongest faith can crack. US debt has surpassed $38 trillion. The government is borrowing money just to pay interest on the money it already borrowed. The machine works, but it's grinding louder every year. Meanwhile, political brinkmanship has turned the debt ceiling into a hostage. Foreign buyers China, Japan, Saudi Arabia have started trimming their Treasury holdings. Central banks are quietly buying gold again. For the first time in half a century, the world's faith in US debt is showing cracks. Not because America lacks money, but because it lacks consensus. And when trust is the only thing holding up the system, politics becomes the real risk. What happens if the United States can't pay its debt isn't a question about dollars. It's a question about belief. And belief, once lost, is the one currency no government can ever borrow back. If the United States ever failed to pay its debt, it wouldn't look like a crash at first. It would look like a pause. A single missed payment. A quiet technical glitch. But behind the scenes, every algorithm and every central bank would feel the air shift because the unthinkable would suddenly become real. In the first hour, markets would freeze. The financial plumbing would cease instantly. Stock prices would plunge because the foundation of valuation future stability would vanish. Then the panic would move outward. Foreign central banks holding trillions in US debt would scramble. The dollar would collapse as investors flee into anything that looks like certainty. Interest rates would skyrocket. Mortgages, car loans all would become unaffordable overnight. Within 2 weeks, the entire global economy would be in cardiac arrest. The real story isn't about numbers, it's about faith. The US doesn't just print money, it prints trust. And if that trust breaks, there's no central bank on earth big enough to fix it. Every empire in history has faced this moment. Rome had its denarius, Britain had its pound. And both discovered the same rule. A currency lasts only as long as people believe in the empire behind it. The irony is that this disaster wouldn't happen because America ran out of cash. It would happen because it ran out of cooperation. The US could pay its bills in a second. But if political paralysis blocks, that ability if ideology overrides function, the result is the same as insolvency. Confidence doesn't care why the check bounced. We've already seen the early warning signs. Each time Congress threatens to default, the world blinks and then pretends nothing happened. But faith doesn't reset. It erodes. The math no longer looks sustainable. And yet, the real problem isn't the debt itself, it's the complacency. The assumption that the system will always renew itself because it always has. History says otherwise. The United States isn't there yet, but it's walking the same road Rome once did, paved with credibility instead of silver. A US default would mark the end of an era not because the numbers stop adding up, but because the story does. For 80 years, the world has believed that the American system would outlast any crisis. If that belief dies, what replaces it won't be a new order, it'll be chaos. The greatest danger to the United States isn't that it defaults tomorrow. It's that every year of political games and financial excess makes the eventual loss of faith inevitable. The longer the country treats its credit like a weapon instead of a responsibility, the more that credit turns back on itself. The United States built its empire on a paradox, infinite debt backed by infinite trust. And for now, that trust still holds. But faith, like any currency, depreciates when overused. If the day ever comes when the US truly cannot pay, it won't just default on its creditors. It will default on history. Because the truth is simple and terrifying. The world doesn't run on money. It runs on trust. And trust is the one currency no nation can print. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers and I'll show you where to look.